So that's all I have to say. This is Gary Katz, who is running on the program tonight, and he will take me through the rest of the introductions and the information to follow.
Gary? Gary? Before they online and say they can't hear. Yeah, no, we're good.
Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for coming on this night. We thought we would do it in March so we didn't hit the April showers, but we were prophetic, and here it is. I want to thank you, and thanks also for all of our guest panelists today. I'll tell you more about them later. But what I wanted to say was two things. One is that we're doing this because so much of our time when we're dealing with real things out on the streets is that we're dealing with stuff that's the old news, you know, things that are fights that have been going on for years, or over parking, fights over other kinds of issues, and we never quite get ahead of the game. Never quite get to the point where we're actually thinking about, you know, what's going to be happening over the next 5 years, and how should we be reacting to it? How can we take advantage of it in what we're doing? And so we want to try to focus today as much as we can about the future, not about the past. Everybody knows that the last 50 or 70 years were the best years for all of these streets here. So let's try to look forward on this thing. The second thing I would say is that I'm going to start by showing you just 10 images so that we all start with at least a common understanding of what's out there and looking at and what some of the issues are that have come to our attention, to my attention, or other members of the board's attention. So welcome, and here goes. I want to start with something fairly simple, which is how big are we? What are we? We're actually a fairly small corner of the Upper West Side. We have 6 block faces, basically. 2 blocks on 102nd, 2 blocks on 103rd, West End Avenue for a block, and Riverside Drive for a block. Seems like nothing, you know, just a little corner of the place. However, what's interesting about it is that in those 4 blocks, there are approximately 2,000 homes, approximately 4,000 people living in these blocks. Now, if you go upstate and go to the nice villages and towns that are up there, many of them are even smaller than 4,000 people on them. So we really have enough of a place that we could actually have much more interaction with each other, much more things could be happening in this area. So if you take the average number of cars per household in this area of the city, there are probably about 540 vehicles owned by the people in these blocks that are in the block association. Next. Sorry, okay. So how many, what does the area look like? Let's see if I can get this thing to work.
You're good. Go ahead. Sorry.
Anyway,
Gary, hand it to me. I'll see if I can get it working.
you just can't see it on that. So let me talk while he's fixing it. If you count all of the on-street parking spaces that there are in these 6 blocks, it's 163 spaces. What we need is, if everybody wanted to park in our neighborhood, we would need 540, and then the employees that work in the places here. And then on top of that, there are the employers' cars, people, and there are service vehicles who are here every day, fixing elevators, doing other kinds of things in the buildings. And so, and then I would say also that if you look at the existing streets, 15 to 30% of the vehicles on the streets have license plates from out of state. A lot of them from New Jersey, but a lot of them from Connecticut and a lot from Pennsylvania, and quite a few from Florida and a lot of other places on it. Moreover, they're there a lot of days because I walk around occasionally and the same car seem to, with license plate seems to be there. So one thing you could say is that if you really wanted to serve those people that were there, only about 8% of the people who are living in this area would be able to park on the streets that we have here. So it's a kind of a lost cause to be debating, only the question of how do we get parking for everybody that's living in the neighborhood on it, and we have to think more creatively. Next.
We have a question online where the numbers are from.
The numbers of people living here are from we distribute to every household a newsletter every day. The others are averages across the area that we live in. Okay. All right. So a few years ago, a number of the people who live in this neighborhood and people that live in neighborhoods around it cooked up the idea of having a shared street along 133rd Street. 103rd Street is actually a really interesting street because it ends at a park at either end of it, and it also isn't a through street. So it seemed to be one that you could imagine using for public events and other kinds of uses that were not being done on that street. Plans were made for it. There was a great deal of discussion and debate about it. There was a lot of debate about how many cars would be displaced in the course of doing it. And after much debate and after the association endorsed the plan and the board of the Community Board 7 endorsed it, and it has been 2 of the 3 blocks have been implemented until now in a much smaller and modified way. Next. And so you will see that if you go outside the door here, and if you'll see it on a good day, especially, you'll see people sitting on those great granite blocks that were put there. We've reduced the crossings so that they're safer. We have done other things that, including some very nice planters with trees and other things in them. And the place is actually quite different from what it was 3 or 4 years ago. Next. It's also been a great place to hold events. And there are at least 5 or 6 events that are organized by various groups along here. One of them that's very popular is Barking Day, when you can adopt a dog and or you can learn things about them and other kinds of things. And so a very large fraction, which I don't have statistics on, people living in the neighborhood, in fact, do have dogs. Next. But there are other things now that we need to contend with. There has been a growing mountain of garbage on the streets. Some of it ordinary stuff that's always been put out in the garbage, now being separated by type. But also huge numbers of cardboard boxes and other things that are the residue of ordering stuff from Amazon and other kinds of people that deliver it by mail to us. And that's not stopping, that's increasing, and it's especially problematic in the winter, especially when there are snow days and the snowplows didn't take over from the garbage collection, and you get accumulations like these. This on the left is on 103rd Street, one on the right on 4th. Next. The city has proposed that we look towards a time when we will have automated collection of wastes. And the idea is that small buildings would have the small buckets that you see there. And in fact, it's been mandated now, and many of our townhouses are actually using those to store their garbage in waiting for the day when they put it out on the curb. But there's also a proposal that some of the curb space be allocated to shared containers, fairly large ones. And in fact, I think the analysis that I've seen on this is that even though you could do probably 2 or 3 shared containers where one car parks today, that's still not anywhere near enough to be able to handle all of the garbage that's being generated by the buildings on the opposite side of it. So what's the issue there? What are we going to do as this thing continues to grow in our problems? Next. Well, I also know what the issues are in terms of deliveries. The fact that it's a 2-step process. A big truck delivers a bunch of things to a location, they sort them out and then give them to people to deliver them to your house or your shop or other kinds of places. It means that streets like West End Avenue are mostly double parked during especially the afternoon hours of the week on it. But also, what are we going to do when we start seeing automated delivery systems? Where will they stop? Where will they leave their stuff, etc. So we have to begin rethinking the whole issue of how do we handle the deliveries, receiving that are being received by people. Not every place has a doorman. There's going to be an issue about where the stuff goes, etc. Next. We also have to start thinking about how to adapt the streets for new mobilities. I see a lot of cars on the streets that are electric cars. I don't see any electric chargers in our area. In fact, the closest one's probably about 6 or 7 blocks away from here on it. We have some responsibility to worry about that. We also, same is true with bicycles. Now, it's true that the rental bike electric vehicles have their own charging stations, but most of our apartments won't let electric vehicles inside them. So we have both a parking and also a charging issue for those. We have issues of small vehicles, an increasing number of them. Many cities are looking at the issue of how they could actually take certain parts of the street and reserve them for small vehicles so that they get preference and encourage people to use them. We will have auto drive taxis, no driver taxis. Where are they going to wait for a person when they're picking them up? We're going to have at some point buses, electric buses that have no drivers. Where do they stop and pick up people? Where do people wait for them? These are all new issues that we're going to have to face up. Next. And this is the last image. We also have to figure out how to maintain the streets. Now, this picture is a little deceptive. On the left-hand side, what you see is a row of double parked cars. Any of you that live here probably know what that is. That means that people are waiting there for the sweeper to come through the street, and then as soon as he passes by them, these people here, they get in behind him and get all the spaces that he's sweeping along in the next block. That's okay if you have the time of an hour or 2 to wait in that, but not everybody has that kind of an option on it. And besides which, on the right-hand side, there are 3 cars sitting there. Not the front one, that's the guy idling, but the people behind him are sitting there. The cars are sitting there with 2 tickets on them, and they're not going to move. And so the effect of this is that the streets have become really, really dirty in our area. And as a result, our board and And we've joined forces with a number of other organizations, with the Love Streets program, with the Mount Sinai halfway house people, with the 102, 103 Amsterdam team bid, and a number of other groups, volunteers and from our groups, and et cetera. And every Tuesday afternoon at 4:30, that group gets together and they make it through every street, cleaning up everything that's left there. Tuesday hours, big day for picking up garbage, so they're getting what's left over on that. But thinking about who's got that responsibility, it's another issue. So I'm going to stop there, and our panelists have many more issues and questions I'm sure they're going to raise. We have 3 people with us tonight. All of them are, I think, the people that know most about these kinds of things in the city. Sam Schwartz was at one time the head of the Department of Transportation and ran a very large consulting firm. He also has written several books, including one called Gridlock, and Sam is actually the person who invented the term gridlock on it. And he now has spent a lot of his time and energy dealing with issues of pedestrians in the city, and how they do better than they can by just being squeezed out of every other place. The second, and he'll speak first, and Rachel Weinberger will speak. Rachel is the head of the Transportation Planning Group at the Regional Plan Association. She's written extensively on transportation issues in cities. She's taught at the University of Pennsylvania. When I was there, she was teaching. She teaches at Columbia University, and so she brings a great deal of knowledge to this. And the third person is Carl Weisbrod. Carl was the previous director of the City Planning Commission, but he's done many things. He headed many commissions and boards and organizations. He was the pioneer of the work of transforming Times Square. He has most recently been the co-chair of the board that was created to figure out how to implement the congestion pricing system. How much to charge, where to charge, and all of the really difficult issues to make it a reality. So I'll ask the 3 of them to come up here, and they'll have talk if I stand and talk, but come up here and pass the microphone. And
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Oops, I just got a text from the police department. Whoever parked an orange couch in the truck loading zone on Broadway would move your orange couch.
Hey, Sam, that's my couch.
Goddamn, move your goddamn couch. Block, yeah. All right, Saxon, yes, he's a shill. To make the point. You know, we leave millions of dollars. What Gary didn't say is millions of dollars of our items are being stored on those streets. I mean, and at one time that was crazy. It was as crazy as leaving a couch on the street. And I know Gary said, let's look forward. I did do a little looking back because many years ago, I was the traffic commissioner, and people came up to me after I towed their cars, and they said, the right to park is written in the Constitution. And I looked, the 10 Commandments, right? Rachel has an 11th commandment. And I looked, I couldn't find it there. And I looked, and we followed British law. And the earliest thing I found was in 1812, Lord Chief Justice Ellenborough, we all remember Ellenborough, he talked about this man who had the nerve to leave a stagecoach overnight, said the King's Highway is not to be used as a stable yard. Even the right of a property owner to park in front of his own property, use the word park, is subject to reasonable regulation. So it goes back at least to 1812. In the New York Times in 1933, overnight parking was banned in New York City with the arrival of the automobile. We didn't allow it. And a judge in New York in Manhattan Court said there was a man who parked and left his car there. He said, a man with your nerve would buy a portable bungalow, put it up in the street, and live there rent-free. So maybe we'll get some ideas for that. But then he went on, and I don't understand this one. What would you think? The man who wore a full dress suit and tan shoes. I don't know what that's all about, but we'd have to go back nearly 100 years. Overnight parking was finally legalized in 1950 in New York. And I think that that was a mistake. Now, I know that part of the interest here is on residential parking permits. I want to tell you the first time that I heard residential parking permits, I was traffic commissioner. It was the 1980s, a long, long time ago. And a group came to see me and they wanted residential parking permit. But underlying that group was they wanted to keep them out of their neighborhood. Meaning Black people were parking in a white neighborhood and they wanted to keep them out. So that's kind of the origin, and it always left a bad taste in my mouth. But if there's going to be an argument for residential parking permit, I don't know if there's Richard Robbins. Richard Robbins wrote, you were quoted somewhere, and I took your quote, and I thought it was the best reason for it quoted in Streets Block for residential parking permits. He said it's worth trying, if only because it would force people to register their car and pay insurance in the city when a good percentage of the cars parked are out of state plates. And I absolutely agree with that. There's a lot of parking by people that are disobeying the law. Not just the law on parking, but the law on registration, the law on license plates, the law on insurance, and means all of us pay more for that. There's also a pretty good article, the New York Times summarized an exhibit, the New York Historical Society, which is right here on the Upper West Side at 77th Street, Central Park West. And it was called Streetscapes Cars, when streets were vehicles for traffic, not parking. And a little quote from that article. And the writer looked at some of the photos from the 1920s and 1930s and said what he noticed was the sidewalks were much wider, making the pedestrian route a real boulevard rather than a little escape ledge. I love that, a little escape ledge. And over the years, I've been collecting how many places in New York City did we widen roadways and narrow sidewalks. Fifth Avenue, the heart of Fifth Avenue. Park Avenue was once a park, literally a park. And we tore it up to make room for automobiles. He goes on to say they're wide enough to have large planted areas, 10 feet wide and 40 feet long. Imagine how many more trees we could have if we had a different attitude towards how we use the street. Most of the wide cross streets were special park streets under the care of the Department of Parks. I'm going to close with a recommendation and partly to go forward, as Gary wanted us to do. And ask yourself, who's in charge of the streets? If something's wrong. Is it the police department? Is it the DOT? Is it the state? Who's in charge? I can tell you that in the 1980s, I was in charge. There was a position called traffic commissioner. And if something happened on the streets, I took care of it. I ticketed, I towed my colleagues. First time I met Rudy Giuliani was after towing a couple of his agents' cars. My agents at that time sometimes were cuffed by the police. They all worked under the Department of Transportation. We need to put traffic enforcement, parking enforcement back where it belongs in the DOT. We need to appoint a traffic commissioner who has backbone. I'm not applying for the job. I've done my term, so don't expect me to apply for it. But none of the nonsense that you're seeing with plates, the TBTA, the MTA, they're catching people when they're traveling or they set up these roadblocks. You know what? You can catch them when they're parked. It's so easy to see cars that have the face plates out there, ghost plates, other things. You need a traffic commissioner. You need one person that says it's my job. Now, nobody. The police don't care because they've got crime to fight. And DOT says, hey, we can't do it. The police aren't doing their job on it. We should end placard parking. Anyone that gets a placard, it should be reported to the IRS. And let's see how long they keep their placard. But right now in the city of New York, if you are friends with a friend who has a friend who works for the city or the fire department or the police department, you're entitled to a placard where you just scribble on it and people will leave you alone. And there are things in the city called no-hit zones where the police, the fire, other civil servants can all park for free. Now, I'll just close with telling you about the best attended session of the United Nations General Assembly. It's when I started to tow the diplomats' cars. And every single country was there and every single country was unified. I brought peace to the world for about 1 minute. Thank you.
Sam, you are such a rebel officer. I don't know about getting reported to the IRS. I don't know if we have an IRS anymore. So Gary invited me to talk about a very open-ended question, and he presented a lot of really good, interesting ideas. And I will say, one of the things that stands out to me about Sam's comments and Gary's comments, that in all of them, there's still an implicit assumption that streets are for cars and that curbs are for parking. And so the question of how many parking spaces were displaced when you converted 103rd Street to a shared street, did somebody ask at a different time how many play areas were displaced? Or how about the beautiful reflecting pond at John F. Kennedy Airport when it was idlewild in order to add more parking? Or how about any number of other street amenities that we might have had? And our streets for people to gather, our streets for goods to move, our streets for, so we really have, I think, a really interesting set of questions to ask before we start talking about how do we solve this particular problem or that particular problem, or how the streets don't get swept, or whether placards are a good idea or a bad idea. But really so before we go there at all, so who are the streets for? What are they for? How can they be used? So I did come ready to engage in a robust discussion with everybody. And I just want to sort of put that question out there. And I want you all to think about how you use the streets and whether what you think the best use of the street is changes or not, depending on which of your own life cycle stages you are in or have been in. And I'm going to just let Carl say what he's got to say. And then I'm really looking forward to answering some interesting questions and posing even more interesting questions. And maybe we don't leave with any answers, but maybe we leave with some better questions.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Sam. I'm glad you set it up, Sam, that parking on the street is not a given constitutional right that's up there with the First Amendment. And I think the good news, I'm sorry?
I suggest one thing, to secure our street, we have the National Guard and more police.
More police, and I agree with
Because our street is fair.
Well, let him talk. We're gonna have questions later.
And I certainly agree with Sam that enforcement is going to be crucial to anything that we do. And I think the good news, at least from my perspective, is that the policy trend after years and years and years of in essence, being receptive to parking on the streets, the policy trend in the city for a whole bunch of reasons is to restrict further and further and further street parking. There's a lot of competition for our streets. Gary mentioned some, let me just mention several others, and they're all more desirable than private car parking, bus lanes, bicycle lanes, sidewalk cafes, pedestrian space, wider sidewalks, a whole host of issues regarding deliveries that Gary mentioned. And increasingly, what the city is doing is not approving or not requiring more parking for new development, not requiring garages for new development. And in fact, cutting back, as we've seen, particularly in Manhattan, street parking at a fairly rapid rate. I will also, like Rachel, want to open it up to questions. I will say one of the things that Sam mentioned that I found very amusing, when we did congestion pricing and established the rules for congestion pricing, the most furious pushback we got were from city employees who have the ability to park in the city for free, basically. Cops can park for free, fire department can park for free, teachers can park for free. They're the ones that had the greatest objection. Judges can park for free. The judges came in to complain to me and to others that they desperately needed their ability to drive to work because, God forbid, they should run into a litigant on the subway. And true. And yet they park for free too. I will say my wife is a retired judge. She took the subway every day for 30 years. She did run into a litigant once or twice, but she survived and she's still alive and life goes on. I do want to mention one thing about residential, two things about residential parking permits. One, and Sam alluded to this, when Gary said that 15 to 30% of the cars in this area that have out-of-state plates, a goodly number of them are not out-of-state residents. And a very few of them, my guess, are out-of-state residents. So the vast majority of people who park on the streets are residents. One thing that's certainly of interest to neighborhoods, particularly in Manhattan and near subway stops on the periphery of the congestion pricing zone, is whether drivers that normally drive into the city or normally would drive into the congestion zone will park and will compete with people, residents in the surrounding area for parking. I think that's worth studying. We don't know the answer to that yet. We don't know the answer to a lot of things having to do with congestion pricing. So far, the evidence in congestion pricing is almost entirely positive. But one thing we don't know, one piece of data we don't know, and we won't know it for a while, is to what extent suburban drivers will drive to subway stops outside the periphery, try to park and compete with residential parkers and residents, and then take the subway into the central business district. That's worth studying, and worth studying with respect to whether the response to that should be residential parking permits. I will say to those who favor residential parking permits, be careful what you wish for. It's another way for the city to tax. And those residential parking permits will not come free. They'll be expensive, and they should be expensive because, as Sam said, we're giving something to someone, essentially a permit that people should have to pay for. And I'll stop there.
I just want to say two things in direct response. First of all, any judge in this city is probably in greater danger of being hit by a car walking than they are running into a litigant on the subway. So good for your wife. The other thing, I just want to talk about this boundary question and what sort of study and attention it needs. The boundary question being, will people drive to the boundary of the congestion relief zone and park in order to avoid paying the congestion fee? In other cities that have implemented congestion pricing, notably Stockholm, London, and Gothenburg, there have not been these effects. And when you think about it, the amount of money in congestion pricing fees that a person would save comes down to $3.20. So by the time you spent an hour looking for a parking place somewhere else near the zone, and then got on the subway to go to your destination, and then got on the subway to come back to your car, you spent $5.80 of the $9 fee just on your subway. And if you're going to get on the subway anyway, you might as well just leave your car at home and get on the subway from there. So there's a real question as to whether, I was speaking to somebody who's in this room now earlier today. I think only George Costanza from Seinfeld is going to do that, but it's still definitely worth keeping an eye on.
Do is ask you to pass, if you have questions, pass them over to Eddie. She's gonna bring them over here, and we're gonna start going through them and asking our panelists to offer their views on them. While that's happening, you guys.
So I'm not gonna hog the microphone, but Gary mentioned that there were 540 cars owned by people in this 4-block area. Is that right?
Yeah.
And about 163 parking spaces. So that's, that's a couple of cars just from the people who live here for every parking space. And that's, I think the idea, I don't want to give into the premise that residential permit parking is the topic of the evening, although there's been a lot of talk about it. But the idea for residential permit parking in people's minds who are advocating for it is that it would make it easier for them to park at the expense of other people who are currently parking. If it was easier to park, then more people would get a car. That's sort of your basic economics. So when you're looking for defining a need for parking of 540 spaces for the residents, plus some number for people who work here and so forth, that number fluctuates with the difficulty or ease with which you find parking or pay for it.
While we're waiting, I just would add one other thing. And again, to broaden this beyond parking. There are some really serious questions about how we use our streets and sidewalks. And obviously, all of us here would say parking is a very low priority, if it's a priority at all. But the other uses, many of which I mentioned, are also all competing for public space. And public space in a dense urban environment is a precious commodity. And we haven't, as a city, entirely figured out how our public space should be allocated. We know it should be, the rules should be enforced, but what the rules are still very much in flux. And there's a lot of competition on things we all consider good. Buses are very important means of transportation. If they can't flow smoothly, that's a bad thing. And many people take buses instead of, for lots of reasons, instead of the subway or have to. Bicycles, an increasing part of our commuting and public life. Pedestrian use, open space, all of these are sidewalks, delivery space. We now have a person in charge of the public realm for the first time in the city, but that person is not an enforcement person. That person is a planner. And there has to be a much broader discussion about how public space is allocated in different parts of the city.
Okay, so there are most of the things on these cards are opinions that have been offered. But I'll ask for comments about them as well. But there are a group of them which have to do with why are we, the person put it here, let me find it here. Why are we subsidizing anybody to use the streets for parking? Shouldn't we be putting our efforts into improving mass transit and not worrying about whether people can find parking spaces? There are several comments on this one on the unsanitary, filthy condition of 103rd between Broadway and West End Avenue because the street sweepers machines are blocked, and how can it be rectified? It lowers my property value on it. Let's talk about the issue of what's the equity? Who has a right, if we have these parking spaces sitting there, who has the right to use them? Does anybody have preferential rights over that? Should we in any way differentiate whether people are more entitled than others?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we should have a hierarchy. And at the very top of that hierarchy are pedestrians. Walkers are the kings and queens of the street space, and we should recognize that. Storage of cars, as you saw, was prohibited until 1950. Somebody said that we shouldn't subsidize people for the storage of their cars. Yeah, we should, price it accordingly, and there is an appropriate price. Now, by taking these streets that you're mentioning on the Upper West Side, which are, I think, curb to curb, roughly 30 feet to 34 feet. And when there's an emergency vehicle, they often cannot get through. And you saw pictures of double parking with cars parked on the other side. So I think health and welfare and safety go way ahead of the use of the need for a car to be parked, especially overnight. We saw what happened with some parking by fire hydrants, and you have that here on the west side as well. People can't find a parking spot, they park by a fire hydrant. But I'd like to talk about another study that I did when I was traffic commissioner, and it was looking at places where the teachers were parking adjacent to schools. And I found every year, 100 children were hit by cars darting out between teachers parking. And I prohibited the teachers parking in school after school, including my kids' school, and it affected their grades. No, I'm just kidding. But de Blasio came back and gave it to teachers. Government workers think it's their right. The police say it's in their contract. And the contract, when I looked at it, it says the city should make reasonable efforts. You could really clamp down on that. So safety has to be there. And if you've got parking on both sides and a truck is pulling in, and every time somebody complains to me about a truck double parking, I say, who said the curb if that truck is double parking? So it's affecting our health, our welfare. If we didn't have the parking, we should then widen the sidewalks and make those park streets that we had 100 years ago, with lots of trees and lots of other entertaining things that 103rd Street has already been doing. That sort of thing would improve our life, make it safer for everybody.
So I think all of us certainly agree about the low, or whether parking should be a priority at all. But I do want to talk about the political realities and the difference between what's right and what political power is. When I was planning chair, I would say the two sort of third rails of being the planning chair were taking away parking and the heights of buildings. And those are the two issues that would drive people crazy when we try to create more housing. Congestion pricing is another example of how powerful people who own cars and care about parking feel. 85% of the people who commute into the central district come by mass transit. 15% come by private automobile. the 85%, 15% are far wealthier than the 85%. The 15% that drive into the city, for the most part, are parking in garages in the city and pay, other than the city workers who get free parking, but are parking in garages in the city where they're paying something like $500 a month. You'd think the world had come to an end when they had a $9 charge that would ultimately go to support our mass transit system. And you've seen the political reaction to that from the suburbs, from even some city legislators. That's not been true for the most part from elected officials in Manhattan. But the power of the parking lobby, and Sam can probably speak to this much more than I can, is very powerful. And it's just an example of what is right is not necessarily something that you can get done. Unfortunately.
Well, unfortunately, I have to agree with everybody. And also note that historically, the questions of what happens with the street have always been fights about political and social class and privilege. It's very nicely documented in a book called Fighting Traffic by Peter Norton. There are other sources, but that's the sad reality of that. But communities can come together, as you have, and created, this block association and created a shared streets. And you can think about what you want in your community, and that can override the self-interested conversations that so frequently dominate these airwaves.
Yeah, following up and saying what you can do. In Barcelona, the community groups have created super blocks. And in those super blocks, it's just for residential access and it's for many other uses. And at one time, Manhattan, all the boroughs had hundreds and hundreds of place streets. Now, we probably have 50 in the city of New York. So there are things a community group could do and may find a receptive ear at City Hall. I don't know if at the City Hall, but at the future City Hall.
So let me add a few more that have come in here. It looks like despite our hope that we might actually go get beyond parking issues, what we've got is 80% of them are about parking here. But let's continue on that because people want to know some things about that. One person asks, how is the decision made to allow a building, a new residential building without any parking?
What's the actual question? How is it allowed?
What are the criteria?
So what are the criteria? Well,
I said how and why are they?
I mean, one thing, I'll give you a second, but one thing in the 1980s, in order to comply with the requirements of the Clean Air Act, the very rational New Yorkers understood that parking begets driving, and driving is the #1 most polluting activity that most Americans indulge in. And so it's true enough. And so to comply with the Clean Air Act requirements, most of Manhattan, so Manhattan on the east side, south of 110th Street, and the west side, I'm gonna get the boundaries wrong. So maybe 110th Street on the west side and a little bit lower on the east side. Those buildings, the zoning there was changed to have a maximum amount of parking that could be allocated. What happens in most of the city, historically, there has been some movement to change this, is that minimum requirements have been applied to all properties, which means whether you wanted to provide parking or not, you had to. And so the criteria for there being no parking or less parking is politically decided. And in our particular case now, what the city has recently done is eliminated the minimums in many more places. So you are no longer required to provide the parking, but you may still, you're not restricted from doing so, but only in these cleaner air zones. Portland, Oregon's done it, Boston does it. Actually, many more places are doing it increasingly because there is some wisdom in it.
Yeah, and just to underscore what Rachel said, it's all done through zoning. It's part of the zoning resolution. And as Rachel indicated, in order to comply with Clean Air Act requirements in the 1980s, the area basically south of here in Manhattan regulated the maximum number of parking garages. When someone applies for when someone applies to build a building in that area, the planning commission determines whether that would be in compliance with the Clean Air Act requirements and the zoning. In other areas of the city, particularly the outlying areas of the city, there are minimum parking requirements, and every time the city has tried to push those, there's been a lot of resistance from elected officials and from local residents. And as Rachel said, that's changing. It changed, for example, if affordable housing, there's no really good reason to have a parking requirement where there's affordable housing, because most of the people who qualify for the affordable housing can't have a car anyway. A. B, there shouldn't be parking required in areas where there's very good mass transit. And C, there shouldn't, in my view, be parking requirements anywhere. Leaving aside the parking issues, the cost to build housing in order to create, cost to build housing is just increased when you have to build parking that frequently, particularly for affordable housing and mixed income housing, isn't even utilized.
When do we get a chance?
Yeah, but when you are on the same page and you won't, many of us did it card, please read the card.
No, let us read.
Read the cards.
I'm trying to read the cards, but it's a little hard when you're speaking. So let me take this card. Someone asked about street trees and how we can do better on them. Parks should put in tree guards around every street tree when they plant them. Second, we need a public education program on the damage that people cause on trees by allowing their dogs to urinate on the around the trunks on it. How can we better manage the street trees that we have and find room for more street trees on the blocks there?
A resource allocation program. There's only, Sam just told us, there's 34 feet from building line to building line. We get to decide how it's distributed, right? Sam also told us that the history is a lot of these streets were parks, but we have chosen to repurpose them in other ways. And so, you know, when the city comes up with a plan to plant 1 million trees, it has to find places. The problem with people and their dogs is a whole other problem. I've never been able to train a dog to use the lavatory in my home. I do see people have trained their dogs to urinate in what actually is air vents for the subway, thinking that they're gutters. And so there's like a whole problem with that in the city, but I welcome your ideas on that topic.
The building was built in 1915, now you're talking about putting trees? We have a couple of trees. It's called Riverside Drive Farm. Trees. Trees.
I want to ask a question that is in some of these, and but is also something that's been discussed, I know, among a number of people in the room here. Most cities in the country have, in fact, instituted some kind of a parking permit system, which gives preference to people who are local. Most of that is being done in areas which are not at the densities that we have here. And so there's much closer correlation between the number of spaces and the number of apartments that there are out there. So that kind of a solution, which is in Boston, in Chicago, and in other kinds of places, is not likely to really work in an area like we have here. Some people, and including a wonderful transportation planner who passed away just a few months ago, Donald Shoup, have proposed that we not think of doing a permit system, but doing instead a kind of street management system. And so that we give over to our streets to an entity in the same way that bids have taken over the responsibility in commercial areas, but give it over to an entity who's responsible for making the best use of the streets as they can, and also doing the maintenance of the streets. So they would probably charge people for a hunting license for looking for a parking space and use that revenue for cleaning the streets. They would deal with the issue of getting people's cars towed if they don't have permits or licenses or other kinds of things like that. What about that kind of a system? I realize this is a system that also would require state approval, as any of these kinds of things do, but it may be a more appropriate system for a higher density area like this.
Yeah, over the years, when I was in city government, people approached me to monetize the street and to do all those things. Chicago got a $1 billion to a company called Laz Parking to take over all their parking meters for 75 years. The city of Chicago cannot do what it wants to do on its own curb spaces because it's in violation of that agreement. So if there was an agreement, it'd have to be crafted carefully. And remember, the private sector is interested in maximizing revenue. And you maximize revenue in parking enforcement by towing away the low-hanging fruit. So the police department that had the tow pound before I had the tow pound and now has the tow pound again, what they would do is not tow the cars that were blocking bus lanes, not tow the cars that were in the heart of Midtown Manhattan causing traffic congestion. They would tow alternate side parkers on the Upper West Side, Upper East Side, because they're sitting ducks. It's very easy if you want to get the numbers. So there has to be a value given. A car towed in Midtown is worth 50 points, one on the Upper West Side, 1 point. Otherwise, I don't have a lot of trust in the people that want to take our streets and make a fortune. They will give you $1 billion or $5 billion or $10 billion to start for a 75-year agreement to own our streets. I'd be very wary of that.
Excuse me, are you going to allow us to speak? We've been sitting here for an hour and 10 minutes listening to your opinions, but you have not given us the courtesy to express ourselves. And if you're not going to let us speak, we can leave.
Why would we have this meeting? Right.
This is not a meeting, this is a lecture.
In the invitation to come to the meeting, we said we would take questions on cards that people offer.
No, you did not. No. It didn't say on cards. I put a card in.
Your bill is not ours.
I put a card in that said, I would like to address your comments. How are you gonna reply to that when you haven't heard no comments?
Well, wait, what's going? My question is on the one. We have one to decide as a free party. The ones that commuters coming in and parking, they go. They park until 11 o'clock, 4:68, and ambulance work. The average employee doesn't do that, can't do that till 11 o'clock. So this is baloney, it's twisting it. The alternates are in the street. My husband gets up sometimes, he doesn't have a good spot, goes out at 9 o'clock, he's retired, he sits in the car. But don't tell me that we have so many employees coming in from the outer boroughs, to park.
I don't think anybody told you that. I don't think anybody told you that,
We watch.
that there were a large number of people coming in from
That's what-
other firms.
Oh, this in my streets and then getting on someone.
No, we didn't say that. We were, yeah.
I mean, it's all, it's all your intensity work if you don't want them.
The answer to the question about will people do that was that the information is not yet available to document whether anybody's doing that. And I agree with you that people are not going to sit in their cars before they go to work. They will be looking for spots on the side where they don't have to do it.
Yeah, more than we should. In this neighborhood, we have a 4 block area, whatever we are, 4 blocks, that our problems are so minor. These buildings were built 100 years ago. And people, they did not put garages in for one thing. If I want to park in a garage, it's about 4 blocks away, it's over $600 a month. And it's full. And I did not expect that. We came to the city too far from when we came 40 years ago. All right, we got there, obviously, and I'm perfectly fine, you can move the car in the morning. But $600 a month, and we need to park there and walk back to my building at 11 o'clock at night, of course, Broadway and up, on the other street, this is ludicrous. And also, let me say.
Well, and maybe, excuse me, sorry. You're telling us that the people like me pay the $600 a month.
Good for you. Good for you. You can
Good for
afford
you.
it. That's one of the people here now.
I'm sorry, but let's. I have a few more questions I can ask our panel to.
Oh, no, we know it. No, what else be? Well, right, we want.
We're not opening it to everyone, because if we open it to everyone.
Why not? Why not?
Because-
You will, and me, I discussed with us.
Sorry, but that's not the way we organize this meeting.
It's not the
Your case, and you're not asking us about our reality. So,
I'm sorry, but. What's that, what you said?
The 1980s, and it talked about, and when you work in the 1980s, you go to. I just thought, what do you have to work out?
Let me take a poll around here. How do people feel? How many people feel that we should continue to use the questions that came in by cards? How many people feel that we should just open it to open questions? It seems to me that the majority.
We have a third option of a shouting match,
Yeah, let's
a third option of just everyone shout at once.
So here, let me take this one here. So much wasted space in the city, why not create multi-floor parking units? Some people find it unnecessary to drive. Many elderly have dogs and bags and mobility issues. How do we get around?
Can I also just read one that came in from Zoom? Enforce the write a card rule. She is disrupting the meeting.
Okay, so what about the business of providing a bill of trying to actually get some parking structures that that in fact do pick up some of the slack on the in this area?
Yeah, there's technology now that allows for automated parking in tiny spaces. Sometimes it's below ground. I've visited a number in Europe. It looks like a one-car garage. Your car drives in and then your car is on a pallet and the pallet takes it. It's kind of like a candy machine. You don't know where it's going to go, but you'll then get it within 3 minutes of when you need it. The city has not caught up with technology. There's one of those that I know is in Chinatown. And I think there's one in a very rich area, and Paul seems to know one of them.
There's a couple when I was, what Sam was talking about, automated garages that have been approved in Chelsea, the planning commission. I don't know whether the buildings are completed yet, but they do allow parking more efficiently. One thing I would just say in response to the question of why not build vertical parking garages, and Sam can speak to when the city ran parking garages. But you know, we are competing for space in the city, and its question is, do we take space for parking, garages? Or do we take space for housing when we have 1 million apartments short?
Want to clarify one thing. I think I was misunderstood to have said that carbon emissions come from cars, which the woman in the black said correctly. More carbon emissions come from buildings than from cars, but I said pollution. So I just want to clarify that for you. So that's volatile organic gases, that's carbon monoxide, not carbon dioxide. There are 6 criteria pollutants, they're called, that are legally enforced since the early 90s, since before we started talking about greenhouse gas emissions. There's particulate matter that causes asthma. Those are pollutants. That is what I'm talking about. So the car is a very big emitter of those kinds of things. So the question now then of what can we do and what technology solutions are there that we can cram more parking spaces into the city? We can put a lot more parking spaces into the city. If we put more parking spaces into the city, we will have more people driving on the city streets. Just as our parking is somewhat limited, our street space is even more limited. So if we wind up with more cars because we have more parking spaces, it's conceivable that we will have more spaces than we can accommodate on the street. That is a reality. So I think it gets back to where we all began this conversation, which really is thinking about what we want our city to be and whether or not we want to save money on parking or have particular privileges. But as long as we continue to keep the focus on our convenience, then I think we don't make very much progress.
Yeah, just a slight disagreement there. If you have finite amount of parking and you make that parking disappear in one of these automated garages, which has been done in loads of European cities, streets that once were filled with cars now are places for people to walk, to enjoy, and the car disappears. The technology is that good. You may have X cars to begin with, and you'll still have X cars afterwards, so you're not encouraging any more driving.
You limit the number.
Yes, yeah, you limit the number of spaces. So generally, what I've seen in,
Streets.
yeah,
Put a small street space, take away a lot.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
You cap it that way,
Yep.
but it's not more parking.
No, no. not
You still
all.
have this same conversation that we're having here. You're parking in my space.
A couple more questions. I think these have come in by the Zoom. What would it cost to put in meters? Installation, surveillance, et cetera. Revenue could help keep clean and pay for shared bins or invest in public transport. And local residents could get a discount.
Costs nothing to put in meters. We make money on meters. A ton of money. Yes, you can have meters. Generally, the Department of Transportation, I'm no longer with the Department of Transportation, I'm a private citizen here. But the Department of Transportation generally keeps them in commercial districts and some side streets, portions of side streets adjoining commercial districts. But as Gary mentioned, Don Shoup said we should really be pricing parking appropriately. So metered parking, and yes, maybe there's a residential pass that allows you to activate the meter. We have half fares on subways. It could be half fares for residents or something like that. But I go back to what I said in the opening. There's no one in charge of our streets. You're talking to us, but I don't even know who you could talk to that would say, hey, let's do it. Let's make that happen.
Okay. I'm going to go back though to the issue that I had raised before, but because in fact, I think actually, Sam, you saw it a little differently than I did. It could actually, if you started a process that where it was nonprofits that were managing the streets, not private enterprises that were managing the streets. You could then actually make investments in other kinds of things. You could create a little swimming pool for the children on one of the blocks out of the revenues that you get from the other uses, et cetera. Would that change the situation?
I ran the largest business improvement district in the city. And business improvement districts can do certain things very well. Enforcement is not one of them. And the only way that the streets can be managed, just going back to what Sam said, is through enforcement. And bids don't have that power and shouldn't have that power. And that's a municipal power, in my view, that the city really has.
And one thing I'd like to add, even with the city in charge, nearly everybody that was involved in the parking program in the 1980s was arrested, indicted, convicted. The reason I got to be commissioner is because everybody else was in jail. So it'll be tougher. It's a tough business for a not-for-profit to get into.
Yeah, we're getting to the end of our time here. Why do so many people who complain about the shortage of parking take 1.5 spots when they park by leaving lots of space behind the cars? As I said, many of these are points of view rather than further. But I'll read a few. Person that says, what about out of rural people? I drive from the suburbs to my city apartment regularly. I've been paying maintenance without the benefit of abatement for decades. Why don't I get a permit for parking there?
Gary, I'll comment on that, if somebody wants it. So my comment's not an answer, but it's a question to you. What problem are you trying to solve? What problem would you like us to talk about? Go ahead, what problem is it?
Gave us the problem.
What's the problem?
You gave us the problem, the street, these two streets, you took away parking for a frivolous, I don't know, planters in the garbage in the street that's collected.
So what is the problem?
The streets are filthy. That's bad. The streets are the way it was.
And the lovely stones, they want to
They
get
block
involved
traffic.
in the streets.
Emergency vehicles can't get through. It's a filthy, dirty, dust collecting area. It serves no purpose to the people that live here. It's your idea in the flag, not reality.
It's not to be contributing, it's a 170 period. This is something that all the other issues that.
So it's fine. So this is not a political meeting. None of us is empowered to have Major Street the way it is or the way that it isn't. If the problem is that the street is dirty, I think that Gary said that there's an organized effort to keep the streets clean.
Once we move.
You don't know what's happening. You all live here, I want to know before. You don't live here.
I do not.
Live here. Yes, no, so they don't live.
For a group that always wants to have something to say, I've heard those things about 5 or 6 times. I know where I live.
But I believe that.
Well, they don't need to know where I live. I live in
In this neighborhood association area, yes or no?
I do. I live at the corner of 103rd and West Street. I'm sorry. If you don't want expertise that is from other places, then you shouldn't have come.
No, you don't have a lot of opinions.
I think what we're gonna do is we're gonna call this, over. Yes.
I don't know, okay, I see in the city, we can apply a lot of different things. And why is it that, moving trucks that have doors on the side, the door thing that you go open, why can't we do that on Highway Street? Because, you know, the other people that through, the truck that's open, you are 99% of the time, the truck's not blocking, out of the way, all of a sudden, there's more accessibility to the streets, and so if you run a 4-lane road, not certainly being a 2-lane road. Is that something, I know, why don't we fight that, I don't fight that, you know, they like, oh, how do you take a, window, or go inside out the other, but obviously. So, if they didn't do that, this is no difference, it's probably even better. But I'm just trying to think of ways how we use the streets, more, making everything go to use.
Yeah. And are you talking about the narrow streets or the wide streets?
Any street, I've got. It's just an attempt to try to, what we could use it, and how can we did a lot of rooms and fire hydrants that up to the blocks get blocked by cars all the time anyway. You know, I mean, I don't know.
Any thoughts? Okay, let's call it quits. I want to thank our 3 panelists. Thank all of you for coming and offering opinions and questions on this, and let me turn it over to him.
Thank you all again for coming. I'd also like to thank the Marseille for allowing us to use their community room. They're very gracious about sharing their space. I'd like to thank Rich Robbins for taking care of our tech. I'd like to thank Gary and Celia and Amy for supporting the meeting, and very much so I'd like to say thank you to Sam and Rachel and Carl for being so informative tonight.
Could I ask all of you for a favor? We're all volunteers here, and somebody has to move the chairs to the edge.